Okay, everybody. I have green lights all around, so thank you for coming in and participating today um, to the August webinar. So, uh, very interesting kind of last couple weeks. So, hopefully, you've all been enjoying the daily dose. And today's daily dose kind of touched on a similar theme as the webinar tonight. That being um, this kind of idea that our, as progressives or Democrats or whatever you want to call, that our knee-jerk reaction to people who are Trump supporters is this intense emotional vitriol or hatred. And I've had, and if you haven't read it yet, um, hopefully you will over the next couple days, because I think it provides some insights based not only on science. There's some really good links there, just some brief and very approachable articles about how we have our own biases towards groups of people, specifically Trump supporters, that prevent us from making connections with them based on our own values. And the topic tonight, which is having several people, one of whom is a new subscriber, ask me, how do you approach framing with conservatives? Because obviously, if you read George Lakoff's books or you watch one of his video presentations and kind of get the idea of framing from Lakoff, him being a progressive, he comes across as being very critical of conservatives. So obviously, you don't want to take that approach with conservatives, yet it's important to make them aware of the function of framing, and that there are these two different moral systems going on, and make them aware of them, and actually try to get them to think in their empathetic brain, think it in the progressive frame. So if you have questions as we go, the chat section there is open. You just type in the box, hit enter, and you can also actually email me, because I have my phone here. And if you send me an email, I will see that. So we can communicate several ways. But more importantly is this idea that the vitriol, the emotional vitriol we feel for Trump supporters and conservatives more generally, can have the function of dehumanizing them. And I'll often do a presentation, and I'll say, is explaining the frame best, or just, well, we're going to talk about that tonight. That's a good question. We're going to talk about kind of how to approach them, so that we do pull them into it as an introduction, but yet explain it in such a way that they understand that they have both frames active in them. So good question. And we'll get to that in a second. So this idea that I say it in presentations that, as progressives, we like to think that conservatives are all mean, greedy, and stupid. And we like to think that Trump supporters are mean, greedy, and stupid. And as I addressed today in the Daily Dose, not all Trump supporters are, Nazi fascists. Not all of them are Klansmen. There are a lot that are just regular people that believe that what Trump's moral system represents is providing them with a better future. And so the idea is to have them understand that there's another system and that there are shared values that we all have. So I'm actually taking the presentation today is something that I've done in other presentations. It's kind of a segment of it, this kind of framing 101 idea. And I think it's a good place to start because we're really talking about the basic aspects of framing. So, it really covers the very basics, and that would be a point to begin. And as many of you know, that it's based on metaphors, and we understand the world largely through metaphor. And one of the ways you can start with people is this idea that the frames define your moral worldview, and you understand that through metaphors. And the metaphor for government or the public is the family, because the first time that you were ever governed is in your family. So for the most part, people have this metaphorical understanding of government through their families. And there are the two models. And this is where I would kind of change it up from what George Lakoff does, is that if you are addressing conservatives and trying to get them to understand the concepts of framing, would be to use different terminologies for the frame. So instead of talking about a nurturing parent or the strict father or the strict authoritarian father in this case, I like to use the terms community frame or community metaphor for the progressive frame, and authoritarian for the conservative. And those are actually consistent with the values of community, and you can't have a community without empathy for other people, and that the conservative frame is based on this authoritarian view of the world and what prosperity looks like, and the hierarchy that's involved too, which we've talked about a lot. So that would be changing those two terms to make it more understandable for people who are self-identified as conservatives, but that have community values and also have authoritarian values. And then, of course, there's two good ideas there for metaphors. That there's the Mr. Rogers neighborhood. A lot of people grew up with Mr. Rogers and understand the idea of caring for other people and caring about your community. And a lot of people understand what James Dobson is talking about when he talks about kind of the idea of a woman's role waiting for their husbands to assume leadership. And what's important to point out here is that most people, the vast majority of people, are biconceptual. And I have a slide that shows that, and of course these will be posted on the website with the webinar over the next day or so. But biconceptual means that people have the capacity to understand and act through both frames. And virtually everybody is biconceptual. You are just dominant in one or the other. And when one is active, the other is suppressed and can be activated by triggers or other metaphors or actions or things like that, experiences also. So you can have both frames existing, and you act on both frames, and it's perfectly natural, it's normal, and it's actually healthy. So it's important to point out to people that acting in the authoritarian frame can be healthy, can be beneficial to you at one time or another, and it's also necessary to act with empathy towards others. So very important ideas there, which I do get to a little greater detail. So the next step, I think, would be that if you're talking to a conservative audience, is to start with the idea of the community frame, because the idea there is that you want to start evoking and making conscious these ideas that are largely suppressed or recessive in them. For example, most people who can watch a movie or a show about a community of people coming together, and they can feel, an emotional connection with that type of feeling, or they do things to help others that make them feel either proud or happy or fulfilled, then they have the capacity for empathy. And that's something that we need to point out and make conscious. So basically, the community frame is based on the idea of having a responsibility for others as yourself. And I like to use the idea that a lot of conservatives I've talked to agree with, and that's the idea that our freedom comes, or your personal freedom, comes with a responsibility for other people's freedom. You can't just do whatever you want at any time with no consideration for others. I mean, think of what the world would be like if that were the case. Think of what kind of society you would have if nobody thought of others when they acted or cared for others in either family, friends, neighbors, whatever. So that is something that can bring people to realize, hey, I get this, I understand it, I've acted in this way at times, and again, it's perfectly normal for the vast majority of the population. And then you can get into a little more detail about how authority is considered in this frame to be the people who live by these values, right? So the people who largely demonstrate these values consistently are the ones that in the community frame people gravitate towards as leaders. So when you're acting or living the community frame, this kind of ethic of excellence or behaving in this frame, caring for others, is how we gravitate towards authority and determine who our authority figures are. Right? And then through the community frame, there is this definition of democracy, which you've all seen many times. And again, when you have people thinking of someone other than themselves, most people would agree with this idea that a democracy is all of us acting responsibly towards each other. Why? Because we care about our communities, we care about society, we care about our nation, our state, however you want to, you put it. But so there's a very kind of simple way to, unveil for people who are conservatives in a very non-threatening way that this is normal, this is part of who you are, and it's healthy. And in fact, the absence of empathy is bad. Right? So if you act with an absence of empathy, there are psychological conditions for that, such as sociopath, where you have no capacity for empathy. And that's a very small, percentage of the population. So it's perfectly normal. So then getting a little deeper is, this idea of community values, right? So what are values that make for a prosperous community? Well, there's a couple things. There's this idea that, so if you act with empathy towards others, that means that you're acting through government, and this is kind of where the government of the people comes in, because you don't want government to be just for a select few, right, who can afford it, which is kind of what we have now. And this is one thing that actually a lot of Trump voters got. And they thought that they were voting for government of the people. Remember, Trump ran on a very anti-government, anti-establishment platform and frame. So people thought that they were going to be restoring government of the people. He said that many times, and people voted for it. So that's very important. And it's something that could eventually cause his frame to be undermined even with his supporters, because he's not living that, authentically. What he said, he's not living. So we, the people, act through government to provide resources to maximize freedom, not only for ourselves, but for others, right? So if his actions aren't doing that, it's just helping him and a few of his crony friends to make more money, then he's not acting consistent with our community values, right? So you see how that can, even for somebody who considers themselves a conservative but understands empathy, right? So that's so to answer the question, that's pulling them into it, but it's also explaining to them how that frame functions unconsciously, right? So you're making the unconscious conscious, right? And then there's a couple of these ideas that private life and enterprise are impossible without the public, and freedom is not possible without the public, right? And why is that? Because you can't just be prosperous on your own. If it was just you couldn't build roads. You couldn't educate yourself to the point of having the experiences that you've had. You need other people to come together and contribute to that, right? And that's part of this community idea. And there's that Elizabeth Warren video that I've played hundreds of times now, where she talks about, nobody was successful or got rich on his or her own, right? There were schools that we all provided that educated people. There were roads we all built. There's other infrastructure. There is healthcare research. There are satellites and science that we all contributed to. There are court systems that corporations have benefited from, et cetera, right? The list goes on and on, right? So those are all things that make a community possible, and it is also what makes us not only free, but also prosper together. So, right, that's kind of the community idea that a lot of people who consider themselves Republicans, conservatives, will understand. And it's a place to start that is relatively not political, right? You're not talking about any specific issues. You're not talking about like a hot button issue. You are just talking about a moral system that everybody, for the most part, has. Right, so then, once you have that explained, I'm just going to take a sip of water here. So then you can talk about the idea of the authoritarian frame or the authoritarian system. And, here's where you can say that even people who think they are progressives at one time or another have acted through this frame. If you are a parent or were a parent or a teacher, or you were leading a committee or a group through some work or organization, at some point you've had to act as the authoritarian to either protect someone, like a child, by defining right and wrong for that person, or ruling through some type of form of punishment, to show that, hey, there are consequences. We all need self-discipline to some degree, and that can contribute to our success. You do have responsibility for yourself solely at times, right? And there are times, probably many times, when many of us have looked towards our self-interest to determine who to vote for or what our government should look like, right? So, we can't live in denial and say that we are, these, pure moral beings who always act progressively. We have to be honest and understand that this authoritarian model fits us at times, and that it becomes active in us at times, and that again, that's healthy, that's normal, and ideally, there should be the capability for all of us to have both frames present and function as a society in a healthy way with both present. The problem is, and this is something that could be explained, I think, once we get through it, once you get through with people, is this idea that things are out of balance, that there is a very significant lack of empathy in our society and politics to the point where it's gotten unhealthy. And what you have is a few people that run things that are acting on, and honestly on both sides of the aisle, acting through, in their own self-interest. They define right and wrong that benefits themselves. They rule through punishment, and they use government to pursue their own self-interest without consideration for others, and that's unhealthy. And I think that could be explained to people who consider themselves Republicans in a way that, as I just pointed out, is not threatening, but points out the reality and the benefit, the positive side of having the progressive community frame be present and active and made conscious. So, there's the authoritarian frame. Again, authority figure defines right and wrong. That's crystal clear. The rule through punishment. That's crystal clear. Self-discipline is what makes you moral. That's how they define success, is that the people who are successful must be the most disciplined and therefore are the most moral. And this idea of democracy, empowers you to pursue your maximum self-interest without any responsibility for others. That's kind of the Trump model right there in a nutshell. So, and what's really important, and I point this out in the Daily Dose today, and because the people, the Guardian interviewed 9 people that were at the Phoenix rally and why they support Trump, and this is, they, in their own words, they lay this out perfectly, and this is something that we can point out to people that, look, this is part of that authoritarian system that is dominant in you, and without having balance, you can see that it creates a lot of problems for our democracy and for our nation. But this idea that success is from self-discipline. So that means that if you're poor, if you're unemployed, it means that you're not a moral person, right? So a question to ask people who are dominant conservative is, so you believe that, if you believe that people with more money are more moral because they've worked harder, then you're saying that anyone who is poor, it's their own fault because they're just bad people. And are there any people in your family, your neighbors, your friends who don't have it so good, who are out of a job, who are struggling? Are they bad people? Of course not. it's not that they're bad people, it's that there are, folks at the top of government and, our financial system who are not doing their fair share or taking responsibility to help empower other people to be as prosperous as they are. Why? Because fundamentally they're greedy. So there's ways to use this to frame a discussion about economics and things like that. I mean, it's getting a little more detailed, but I think for starters is to point out that, your understanding of poor people as being bad and immoral and undisciplined is part of a moral system that is dominant in you as a person, and there is another one there that says something else. So, it's very important to understand that whole connection with discipline, morality, and success, because it basically assumes that somebody who's wealthy is a good person and a moral person, and that's how they become successful. And I think there are ways to chip away at that with people once it becomes conscious. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is something that progressives and Democrats really have a hard time wrapping their brain around, because for one thing, a lot of progressives and Democrats think that everybody views the world the same way we do. In this rational, everybody reasons to the right conclusion, and anybody that doesn't reason to the right conclusion and votes for Donald Trump must have some kind of brain damage, or just be stupid, or they're just a Nazi or a fascist. When in reality, it's part of a moral system, and it's part of what they hold very deeply in their core beliefs. And we didn't talk about hierarchy in the conservative frame. That would be a webinar in and of itself, but basically the hierarchy is one of the things that determines authority. So basically you have this idea that there's God over man, and Christian belief over non-Christian belief, at least is in the United States. White people over non-white people, men over women, rich over poor, parents over children. The list goes on and on and on. And that makes up a huge part of their frame and authority. So that's important to understand too. And what progressives and Democrats don't understand is that it's part of a moral system. So, people who are in the conservative brain, they are not patently, all of them, are not patently Klansmen or racist. It's part of their moral system, and it's not. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't make them patently racist. It's part of their moral system that puts whites over non-whites in terms of authority figure. So, it's kind of a slippery slope to label them all as racist. It's better to address the moral system and make them aware of it, and then say, but there's this other part that says, we're all created equal, and that we have a moral responsibility to care for others as ourselves, and that means everyone. So it's better to contrast the two moral systems than to dehumanize and label people as something. So that's kind of the point there. So biconceptuals are, probably closer to 70% of the population, which means that from what I've seen, from what Lakoff has written, you have about 10% of that remaining 30% have no understanding of the authoritarian frame. They only care for others. They largely don't care for themselves. They put others first. That can be unhealthy. And then you have another 20%, since the conservative frame is dominant in public discourse, so the larger portion of that 30% are authoritarian only and have no capacity for empathy. And I think you could probably put Donald Trump in that, and many of his extreme followers, right? I mean, you have his approval ratings like hovering around 34-35%, and there are people that say, well, it would probably never go below 30%. And why is that? It's because those are people who are the extreme, having very little to no capacity for empathy. So that is probably a very realistic number. But it's the rest, that you want to work with and that you want to start making connections with. Because both frames are active depending on the context and the situation. Right? So if you put people in a situation, say somebody who's really conservative, dominant, in a situation where their neighbors are in jeopardy or somebody in their family is in jeopardy, all of a sudden, boom, the progressive frame, the community frame is going to kick in, and they're going to be right there helping. And they're going to go through the depths of hell for people they care about because they have the capacity for empathy, right? And one frame becomes dominant based on this thing called neural binding, because every time you think, you frame, and the frame that's used the most is the frame that's dominant through neural binding, right? So what we want to start doing is, to the people who have asked this question, how do we approach conservatives with this concept of framing without sounding like we think that they're all mean, greedy, and stupid, is just like this, that, consciously make people aware of the frames so they can start consciously choosing frames, in their interactions with people and being aware of them. So in terms of speaking to, other progressives and, your organizations, and then once you start making connections with conservatives and discussing the fact that, hey, you may be dominant conservative, but I guarantee you that you have the capacity for empathy. Either in your family, your friends, your community, your organizations, whatever it is. It's to start identifying the difference between moral and partisan through the frames. And I've talked about this a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen, we've talked about this before, but it's really important because, again, Democrats and progressives are really bad at this. They see an issue, and right away it's, this issue position is either Democratic or Republican, or they label it progressive and conservative, equating it with the partisan Democrat Republican, as opposed to community authoritarian. Which moral frame is it? Which one am I, or this person, or this group? Which one are they functioning in? And where's biconceptualism in conservatives, right? Where are they acting as biconceptuals? I mean, look at Republicans that are, ready to abandon Trump. And where are they acting in the progressive frame, the progressive community brain? Where are they caring about their community in their abandoning Trump? And see, that's important because that gives us opportunities to reach out to people and talk about caring for others, right? And then making them aware that, hey, so this authoritarian world that you're living in, maybe it's not the best one to be functioning in all the time. Maybe there are times when we have to care for others. So, I'm hoping that these are ideas that can, that can help you all. And there's not been very many questions tonight, so either I'm doing a really good job or, or, it's going to take time to process. But, I think that, maybe another step for us as a group is to start, making some inroads in some red areas with some of these ideas, whether it's in community groups outside of politics, or even some political aspects where there are both Republican and Democrats present, things like that. Because I'm going to go back to my big giant head here. Because I think this is really important. It was kind of interesting in terms of the Daily Dose. There was actually a comment from somebody on one of the things that I posted it on a group page, an edited version from what you all get as subscribers. It was like an excerpt of it, kind of abbreviated, didn't have all the information you all get. And somebody actually said that they were sick of the idea of pandering to these morons. And my response was, well, you just kind of fell into that trap. By saying pandering to these morons, you're implying that they are all morons, and that pandering means that we have to yield something to them, when what I'm saying is no. You have to understand that a lot of them share your same values. They're just regular people who are trying to have a better life, and by saying that they're stupid or calling them morons, you're behaving exactly the way Donald Trump wants you to behave. And so there we go. So any other questions? I hope this has helped. Yeah, that's a really good, really good observation. Yeah. Right, so thus the idea of changing that to community worldview and authoritarian worldview. I think some of the ideas can be made more approachable just by talking about. Where's this slide? I think this is fairly approachable, but when you get into this kind of talking about people acting through government to provide public resources to maximize freedom, that does sound a little bit wonkish, to coin a term. Better, you could very simply say, look, we act through our local government, to help people be free. And that's part of what community values are, right? Freedom not possible of the public. That's pretty. The idea that look, your freedom comes with responsibility for other people's freedom. So that's a good thing to be aware of. And it's also part of knowing your audience, right? So knowing your audience is important as to terminology and things like that. And obviously, this can be an ongoing, ideas and discussion. But for example, here we go. This one here, the idea of discipline making someone moral. That's pretty understandable, and the idea of democracy being to maximize your liberty to seek your own self-interest. So those are the kinds of things that I think the majority of people would get. But that's a really good point, to use kind of common language, knowing who your audience is. So, okay, good. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for participating. Hope it's been helpful. This will be up on the web, and I'll get an email out. Obviously it's summertime, so little lighter participation tonight than usual. But thanks for being on and for spending the time. And I will see you when I see you, and look for the email with the posting and the Daily Dose tomorrow, which will be fun, looking at some specific ways to message to the Trump voter, again, to try and get them consciously thinking in the progressive brain. Even if it's not an issue, to get them thinking about caring for others. So, have a great night, and see you soon.